Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for being here today for this webinar presented by Behavioral Economics in Action at Rotman in partnership with the Behaviorally Informed Organizations Partnership. Although we're meeting virtually, we wish to acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. My name is Dana, and I'm a PhD student at Rotman and the moderator for today's webinar. We're really delighted to have Dr. Nancy Sin from the University of British Columbia. But before I introduce Nancy, I'd like to go over the ground rules for the webinar. So following this introduction, our speaker will deliver a 30 to 35-minute presentation. During the presentation, please submit questions for our speaker by clicking the Q&A tab at the top or bottom of your Zoom screen and typing into the entry box. At the end of the talk, and with time permitting, we will have a question and answer session in which I will select questions from the Q&A tab to ask our speaker. Now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Nancy. Dr. Nancy Sin is an assistant professor of psychology at the University of British Columbia. As a health psychologist, Dr. Sin's research focuses on biological and behavioral pathways linking daily experiences, including stressors and emotions, with long-term health and well-being. Dr. Sin is particularly interested in daily positive events as protective factors for stress processes. She has published extensively in journals for behavioral medicine, psychology, and aging. Her work has been supported by grant funding agencies in both Canada and the US, and Dr. Sin has held leadership roles in the American Psychological Association and the American Psychosomatic Society. In addition, Dr. Sin directs the UBC Psychology Diversity Mentorship Program to provide mentorship to students from traditionally disadvantaged, underrepresented, and marginalized backgrounds. Thank you, Nancy, for being here today, and please take it away.
Hello, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here. I'm so honored to be invited. So what I will do is I'll share my screen. Go, and then I will put this in presenter view. All right, is everything looking okay? Okay, all right, I can't actually see any comments here. So I'm going to assume everything's fine.
Yes, everything's great, thank you.
Okay, perfect. So I'll be talking about enhancing health and well-being in everyday life. And in this talk, I am going to focus on some of my recent work in the past couple of years about the COVID-19 pandemic. Okay, so before I get started, I want to first acknowledge that this work has been conducted by a team of really wonderful folks. I want to acknowledge the work of my lab. And so here's a photo of us earlier this week having a positive experience. And I'll be talking more about positive experiences in a moment. And this work about coping with the COVID-19 pandemic would not have been possible without the contributions of my wonderful collaborators. I've got them listed here. And I also want to acknowledge Shirk and the Michael Smith Foundation for Health Research for funding. And then, of course, I also want to acknowledge that I am coming to you from the unceded ancestral and traditional territory of the Musqueam people. All right, so what am I going to be talking about today? First, I'm going to talk about some of my pre-pandemic work on positive well-being and its role in stress and health. And then I'm going to really focus on the work that I've been doing during the pandemic to try to understand how it is that people are coping and what are some of the factors in daily life that are health protective. And in particular, I'm going to focus on positive events, prosocial activities, and sleep. And then I'm going to talk about everyday discrimination. So I'm trying to pack a lot in here. And that is going to weave in some of the themes from earlier in the talk. And finally, I'll end with talking about the implications for intervention and for daily life. Now, we all know that there is a mental health crisis due to the pandemic. There have been many studies around the world published about increased stress and increases in the rates of mental disorders. For example, in 2020, there was an estimated global increase of over 53 million cases of depression and over 76 million cases of anxiety disorders due to the pandemic. And this was according to a paper that was published in The Lancet last year. Here in Canada, the Canadian Social Survey found that 46% of Canadians said that they were more stressed than they were before the pandemic. And if we look at in the States, 67% of Americans say that. And so we know that across the board, there's been increases in stress, but the burden of that stress is unequally distributed in the sense that some portions of the population are disproportionately impacted. So for example, some of the data from Canada suggests that women, especially those who are mothers, as well as people who are healthcare workers and LGBTQ2+, that those are some examples of segments of the population that face greater stress. And there's been research, we're 2 years into this pandemic, but there's already indications that pandemic-related stress can have longitudinal effects. And I think that this is really important when thinking about how it shapes our health and well-being in the years to come. So you might be thinking, you might have thought about, how did your stress in 2020, in 2021, and now in 2022, that pandemic-related stress, how does it impact your health in the years to come? So I really think about stress in across many different theoretical models. And one that I really love is this one by Alyssa Epple and colleagues that was published in 2018 that merges many perspectives. And in particular, I want to draw your attention to this portion of the model that hones in on acute stress processes and also stress as it plays out in daily life. I think this is really important because it highlights, so let me kind of zoom in right there. It highlights aspects of the stress process that can help us understand how stress gets under the skin. And it's also really important when thinking about how to intervene to mitigate stress or the effects of stress. And so some of the work that I'll talk about today will focus in large part on emotional reactivity or emotional responses associated with daily forms of stress. However, I also want to mention that some of the other work that I've been doing that I won't have time to talk about really looks at these other aspects of stress, like forecasting or predicting whether stress is going to happen, anticipating it, and how people recover. Okay, now I said that I am interested in stress in daily life, and that's because I'm really looking to understand the process of how people adapt when they are in situations of stress, as well as when they are in situations where they're not stressed. So we're really comparing a person to themselves, where a person serves as their own control. So in my research, I take this ecological approach where I use a variety of methods to examine stress and health as people naturally go about their daily lives. So for example, in my work, we've used telephone interviews. We often use mobile surveys where people fill out surveys throughout the day, reporting on what they're doing in that moment and whether anything stressful had occurred. We also ask our participants to wear ambulatory devices such as an accelerometer or a sleep watch to track their health. And of course, now with apps, there are so many different ways that we can measure health innovatively and in ways that don't really disrupt a person's life as they're living their life. And I also utilized field-based biomarkers, although I won't talk about that too much in today's talk. Okay, so in my past work and in work that my colleagues have conducted, we found that people differ, obviously, in their emotional reactions when they experience a daily stressor. So a daily stressor, sometimes this is called a hassle. You could think of this as running late for a meeting, having technical difficulties before giving a presentation, or having some interpersonal conflict. So these are experiences that occur often in daily life, and they can pile up over time, so they can accumulate to potentially impact long-term health. And so there is now, as you can see on this slide, a great deal of evidence suggesting that how people respond to stressors in their daily lives does have implications for their health. So the people who tend to have greater increases in negative emotions or decreases in positive emotions on days that are stressful compared to their own level of emotions on non-stressor days, that those folks who are more emotionally reactive, they tend to have, for example, higher levels of inflammation, lower heart rate variability. Their health behaviors, including sleep, tend to be worse than those who are less emotionally reactive. And then there are also these long-term impacts of daily stress, including risk for mental and physical health conditions and premature mortality. Now, I've been talking about stress that occurs in daily life, and I want to kind of share some interesting things that I found before the pandemic. Now, we know that stressors are common, but one of the really interesting things I found, so I think that label was supposed to be all the way over there. But when we look at people's daily lives and we ask them whether anything stressful had happened or whether anything positive had happened, we find that in this national US sample, that on 40% of days on average, people report just a positive experiences with nothing stressful that had happened. So that should say stressors only. So on 8% of days, people report having a stressor, but no positive experience. And what I find really fascinating is on 34% of all the days that we studied, we find that people are reporting both positive and stressful experiences on the same day. So I think that's fascinating because it brings up this question of, well, why are these events co-occurring? And do positive experiences potentially have some role in mitigating stress? And then lastly, I wanted to point out that on 18% of days, we find that people report not having any stressor or positive events. Okay, so then let's kind of turn to that first question of do positive experiences have any impact on health? So there has been a growing body of research in the past. It's been going on for a while, but especially has really accumulated in the past 20 or so years, showing that people who have greater levels of positive well-being, which we could think of as, for example, having higher trait-like levels of positive emotions, having more purpose in life, being more optimistic, as well as experiencing more daily positive events, that these forms of positive well-being are associated with longevity, with lower risks of developing chronic conditions such as cardiovascular disease, as well as better outcomes among people who already have health conditions. So for example, a lower risk of a subsequent heart attack among people who already have cardiovascular disease. And so those who are happier or have greater positive well-being also tend to feel subjectively that they're in better health, which we know is really important because it taps into aspects of health and well-being that we don't necessarily know just from looking at objective markers. And something that I've been really interested in is positive experiences and whether they're related to better health behaviors. And in some of my past work, I have found that among patients with cardiovascular disease, those who are happier tend to be more physically active, they're less likely to smoke, they're more adherent to their medications, and they have better sleep quality. So this really shows that positive well-being is protective for health. Now let's kind of focus in, rather than just kind of thinking about trait level, are you a happy person or not? I like to think about the things that happen in daily life, because I think that's where we've got a lot of potential for intervening. And I have found pre-pandemic that across various samples and studies, that people who tend to have more positive experiences in daily life, such as having a positive social interaction, getting a hug, taking on a pleasant walk and spending time in nature, or completing a task that feels really good. Those are experiences that occur very commonly, and the people who have more of those experiences, they tend to have steeper diurnal cortisol slopes across the day, which is associated with reduced health risks. So for anyone who doesn't know, cortisol is a marker of the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, and often referred to as a marker that's associated with stress. Now, we also find that people who experience more positive events tend to have lower levels of inflammation, and they have better sleep, and they sleep longer. And now, all of these pathways are really important for downstream health. Okay, so I've kind of talked about, just briefly, the ways in which I think about the role of positive experiences and stress. There's been many theories and conceptual models within health psychology and in the stress literature and in other literatures as well, to posit to suggest mechanisms for why it is that positive experiences can be beneficial. And what I wanted to turn to now is honing in on this during the pandemic. So I'll start by talking about age differences and how people have coped with the pandemic. So this was based on data that we had collected really early on. So it was in March and April of 2020, when life was really chaotic and there was so much uncertainty. And so we had a sample of 776 adults with a wide age range from 18 to 91. And we asked these participants to complete a survey on using a phone. So it's a web-based survey. They completed the survey every night for a week. And in the surveys, we asked them to report on their emotions that day, whether they had any stressful and positive experiences. We also asked about their levels of COVID-19 related stress. So for example, how threatened they felt by COVID-19 in terms of their health, their finances, and so on. In case you didn't know, I'm really interested in adult development and how people maintain their well-being as they get older. This is, of course, really important for physical health, but important really across in so many ways when we think about the impact of aging on society. So one of the first things I want to point out during using these data from the pandemic is that exposure to stressful experiences tend to differ based on a person's age. And so I've got these different kinds of daily stressors listed here on the bottom of the screen. And so this on the y-axis indicates the percent of days on which any stressful event had occurred in these categories. So whether, so for example, on about 18% of days, people tended to report that they had an argument with someone else. And that was the case for younger and middle-aged adults, but less so for older adults. So we find across the board that younger and middle-aged adults tend to have more daily stressors across many different life domains, including at home and at work. The one exception is that older adults had more of these like other miscellaneous stressors, and we're not sure why and what that is, but it does make me wonder whether we should ask better questions to try to truly capture the range of stressors in people's lives. So you might be wondering, why is it that younger and middle-aged people were experiencing more stress when in fact, especially early on in the pandemic, much of the public discourse was about the risks of COVID-19 for older adults. Well, if you think about this from the perspective of social roles, we know that younger and middle-aged people, and so in this case, we used age as a continuous variable, but we also, just for the purposes of this figure, I've split it up so that younger refers to under 40, middle-aged, I believe this was 40 to 59, and then 60 and up we kind of categorized in the older group, just for descriptive purposes here. And so for those who are younger and middle age, they're often coping with taking care of their kids. Middle-aged adults often have other responsibilities in terms of caregiving for aging parents. They're trying to juggle their family and their work responsibilities all during the pandemic. So there were, in some ways, this makes a lot of sense. And what I find really fascinating is when we ask people about, when they did report a stressor, we then ask them follow-up questions like, how much was your stressor related to COVID-19? How stressful was it? How much control did you have over the situation? And how well do you think you handled it? And something that is really interesting is that older adults will rate that they feel like they have less control over that stressor compared to people who are younger. But they would also say that they felt that they coped better with those stressors. So it seems here that it really lines up with the literature on aging which shows that older adults tend to have better emotional well-being, and that there are a number of theories to explain this. For example, changes in people's goals and motivations as they get older, as well as the life experience built over time in terms of learning how to best regulate one's emotions. So I think that this also points out some additional targets for intervention in terms of intervening upon a person's sense of control and the ways in which they could cope to more effectively. Now I'm going to talk about positive experiences, and you can see here we've got these different kinds of positive experiences that we've asked about. So social interactions, positive social interactions that occurred in person versus ones that were remote. And you could see that middle-aged adults actually reported more in-person social interactions very early on in the pandemic. And this was not surprising. It's likely due to them having children in the home and be more likely to have a spouse in the home. And with remote social interactions, surprisingly, these were the older adults had more of those compared to the younger group. Also, middle-aged and younger adults had more work positive events, and that's because they're more likely to be in these roles in which they're working. Now, a network event is a positive experience that happened to someone else in your social network, but that felt positive for you. And the older adults were much more likely to report that this was a positive event for them. So they're really kind of gaining that positive experience from their social network. And also older adults were spending more time in nature. So I hope that this gives you a sense of the kinds of positive experiences that tend to happen in daily life during the pandemic. And it's really remarkable that these experiences occur much more frequently than stressors. They're reported on most days in terms of interpersonal social interactions that are positive. So I'm going to turn now to talking about prosocial activities. Okay, so I've been kind of talking about positive experiences and highlighting the fact that many of these positive experiences tend to be interpersonal. We also find that younger adults tend to benefit more emotionally when they do experience a positive event. So I think that that's highlights one of the ways in which people are potentially coping with stress during the pandemic. But another way that people have coped with stress during the pandemic and in the before times is turning their attention to helping others. So, for example, there are many prosocial activities that people can engage in daily life, such as volunteering. And I would call this formal volunteering through an organization or a group, such as a church, or volunteering at the local school. There's also providing unpaid assistance, and that to someone outside of one's household. So that could be bringing groceries for a neighbor or picking up medicine for them. It could be driving a friend to see the doctor. And also providing emotional support is another very common way in which people try to help others in their daily lives. Now, first, I'm going to take a moment and talk about some data from before the pandemic, and then we can kind of compare that to how things are different now. So we already know from before the pandemic that older adults are really the backbone of the volunteering workforce in Canada. So older adults devote many, many more hours compared to middle-aged and younger adults on engaging in formal volunteering. Now, I have some data that we've examined in 2 samples from the US that in total, we had about 2,800 participants. And we found that the people who tended to engage in these prosocial activities of volunteering, providing unpaid assistance, and providing emotional support, that the people who engage in those activities tend to have better emotional well-being, fewer stressors. They tend to have fewer physical symptoms compared to the people who don't engage in those activities as often. But what I find is really interesting and revealing is when you look at a person's well-being on days when they do engage in these activities, so how do their emotions change when they're volunteering? And that's when we find that there were actually some costs of helping others. So on a day when a person is volunteering, they're much more likely to report having a stressor on that day. It's when they provide unpaid assistance or provide emotional support, people are also on those days more likely to report increases in negative emotions. But there are benefits as well. They also report increases in their positive events on those days. So this really shows that when you take time to help someone else, there's these benefits of feeling better, engaging in building social relationships, but also these costs of it makes it a much more stressful and busy day. It's also, when you're providing emotional support to someone else, usually that's a very stressful situation, one that in which you're helping someone who might be in some distress. So then the helper then absorbs some of those negative emotions. But something that's important to note is that older adults tend to have more of these benefits of helping, and they have lower costs. So for the older adults, they tend not to have as high of an increase in negative emotions when they're providing emotional support. They're also kind of buffered against the increase in stress on days when they volunteer. Now, think back a couple of years ago, you've probably heard people talking, and as well as all over the media, lots of public interest in helping other people during the pandemic. So here's just like a few headlines from that. People were organizing, joining mutual aid groups. There was a lot of prosocial behavior happening. So you might wonder, well, obviously this helping, it has social benefits, but what about the benefits for the person who is providing this help? So we had, here's some data kind of using the same data set that I've talked about before, in which we asked participants every day for a week to tell us about their day. And at this point, we had continued to collect data through August of 2020. So we had a larger sample. And just like before the pandemic, older adults were more likely to help in various ways in terms of formal volunteering, as well as what we call support transactions. So both giving as well as receiving support. And this was actually a bit surprising. I had expected that during the early portion of the pandemic, that because older adults were they might have had limited opportunities to help outside the home just because of the stay-at-home restrictions. But it might be the case that older adults already were linked into networks in which they had opportunities to provide support. We found that when people engaged in these prosocial activities, they had improvements in their emotions that day. They also felt more satisfied with their social relationships on that day. And something that was very interesting is that we no longer found these costs of helping. So it wasn't the case that providing emotional support to someone would then lead the support provider to have an increase in negative emotions. We actually did not find that, surprisingly. And I think one of the potential reasons why is that during this crisis, it was much more common to receive help. And so I think a person receiving help and giving help might be less likely to feel as if they were a burden on other people. And then there were also some age differences in the kinds of support provided, with middle-aged adults being most likely to provide what we call tangible forms of support, like providing services like driving someone to a doctor's appointment or bringing a meal to a neighbor. So I've talked about daily positive events during the pandemic, and then pro-social activities, and how that can buffer against stress and bolster a person's emotional well-being. So now I want to talk about sleep. I think sleep is so important to emotional and physical health. So in the English language, we have many idioms about sleep that convey how important it is to our emotional well-being. So whenever you tell someone that they should sleep on it, or they shouldn't lose sleep over a problem, we're really kind of talking about that in terms of the connections between sleep and mental health. Now, 1 in 3 Canadians don't get the recommended amount of sleep. So here this is showing like the recommended sleep duration range for various age groups. And for adults, it's generally recommended that people sleep for at least 7 hours a night. If they are a relatively healthy person, obviously they might need more sleep if they're sick or recovering from sleep debt. And there are a large proportion of adults who don't get that amount of sleep. And in my past work, we know that sleep is very closely tied to stress. When people have poorer sleep or not enough sleep, then the next day they're more reactive to stressful events. They're also more likely to report experiencing a stressful event. So sleep is important in so many ways. And of course, I've just talked about emotions, but we also know that sleep is one of the behavioral pathways that underlie disease risk for a whole host of different chronic conditions. Sleep is also really important for cognitive functioning, for our safety, and for our relationships and overall quality of life. So I've been very interested in sleep. I've been kind of publishing on it and working on looking at sleep in various ways. And so during the pandemic, again, using kind of that same data set of adults across a wide age range, and this is spanning Canada and the US, we asked people each morning to tell us about their sleep. Like, what time did you go to bed last night? How long did you sleep for? How often did you wake up during the night, for example? And then at the end of the day, we ask people to tell us about their day. So whether they had any physical symptoms such as pain and fatigue and headaches, which are really common during the pandemic. And they told us about their emotions and their stressors in the day. So what we found in this data during the pandemic is it's actually similar to what we found pre-pandemic, which is that after a person has better sleep compared to their usual or average level, as well as longer sleep than their usual, or it's more efficient, meaning that their sleep is, they're less likely to kind of wake up through the night and they can fall asleep quickly. After this better, longer, and more efficient sleep, the next day people are less likely than usual to have physical symptoms. They tend to have lower negative emotions, and they have a reduced odds of encountering a stressful experience on the next day. So I think this really points out the importance of sleep as a behavioral strategy and as a health strategy for helping to bolster emotional well-being and to mitigate stress. But as you as you know, there are these differences between people in terms of how much they benefit from sleep. So some people are much more affected by fluctuations in their sleep. So you, or maybe someone you know, tend to be super cranky after not getting enough sleep. Whereas you might know other folks who are pretty resilient even when they haven't slept enough or slept well. So there are individual differences in how much people are emotionally as well as cognitively affected by fluctuations in their sleep. And what we found that was really surprising during the pandemic is that people who were in general more stressed about COVID-19, that they tended to gain less of the emotional benefits of sleep. So let me show you here. This figure on the left is showing sleep quality, and the figure on the right is showing a person's sleep duration. And in general, people who have lower COVID-19 threat, so less threatened by COVID-19, they have these like steeper slopes, that's like the lighter dashed line, showing that when they get better sleep or they sleep longer, then the next day they're less likely to encounter a stressful experience. But those who are under more stress tend to not have as much of that benefit in terms of their stress levels. So I think this really suggests that stress needs to be managed in order for these health benefits and psychological benefits of sleep to be apparent. Okay, now, how am I doing on time? I think I'm gonna try to finish, I'll spend a couple more minutes. And okay.
I think a couple more minutes is good, Nancy.
Okay, great. So the last thing I want to talk about is everyday discrimination. And these are experiences of unfair treatment based on one's group memberships, such as, for example, perceiving that you've been treated unfairly based on your gender, your age, your race, and ethnicity, and a whole host of different identities. And of course, these identities can intersect as well. Now, there has been a lot of research in the past that has shown that people who experience more everyday discrimination, that they tend to have many different health risks that then can increase long-term risks for the development of chronic diseases and premature mortality. Now, but let's talk about discrimination during the pandemic. Here's some data from Statistics Canada showing that, I think about almost 30% of people in their data reported experiencing some discrimination during the pandemic. But you could see that these rates are higher based on other identities, such as among people who have a disability or who are gender diverse or visible minorities. And in the US, Asian and Black Americans were more likely to report negative experiences because of their race or ethnicity since the pandemic started. Now, I'll try to get through this quickly, but this is just some of the work that I'm just kind of putting up some questions that we asked people in surveys every day. We asked whether they were treated as if their well-being was less important than others. Did other people act as if they were better than you? Were you treated with less courtesy, for example? So these are some of the ways in which ways in which people are treated less fairly and due to their group membership. And so we find that on days when a person reports that they've experienced this unfair treatment, they tended to have worsening emotions and an increase in their physical symptoms. But something that I want to highlight that's at least a bit comforting or positive here is that people also report that on days when they had discrimination, they also could have a positive experience on the same day. And when that happens, people tended to have less of an increase in negative emotions. So let me show you what I mean. Oops. Oh, yikes. I think my PowerPoint stopped. I will just bring this up. Okay, I just have a couple more slides. So this and okay, this is working. Great. So what we find is that when people experience more discrimination, they tend to have this increase in their negative emotions. And so this is kind of showing an estimated slope or association when a person has kind of their usual level of positive events. But when people have discrimination, but they also report having some positive events, and this might be reaching out to others for support, it might be actively engaging in a different activity to offset those negative emotions associated with discrimination, then there's a less steep increase in their negative emotions on that day. So what are some of the implications? This is where I'd love to chat and get feedback from the group. I've been really focused on trying to understand these processes that occur in daily life. But in the past, I have conducted research on positive psychology interventions, so activities that people can engage in to increase their positive emotions, their positive thoughts and behaviors. And those, so engaging in these positive experiences have been shown in past work to enhance a person's well-being as well as reduce their depressive symptoms. So thinking about the pandemic, I think what we find is that strengthening relationships, for example, through helping others, through reaching out to people for support or providing support, checking in on folks, that seems to be one of those key habits of people who tend to have better emotional well-being. Okay, yes, and then another thing is that people can notice, seek out, or create positive experiences. I'm really interested in the extent to which people try to seek out these opportunities to have a positive experience. And I wasn't able to talk about sense of purpose, but we've had some work looking at purpose during the pandemic. And so people who are more purposeful, they tend to engage in more meaningful activities, personally meaningful. They also tend to still have lots of stress. And that's because people who are purposeful, they don't shy away from challenging experiences. And I think a really good tip, one that behavioral scientists can have a lot to contribute in terms of thinking about strategies, is helping to optimize sleep hygiene. So thinking about ways in which we can aim for a more sufficient sleep duration, quality, and more consistency in sleep from night to night. And for example, when we think about large scale implementation of that, that would be changing school start times, for example, or perhaps providing flexibility in the workplace that allows people to structure their schedule in a way that maps on to their natural rhythms. Now, I know I've been chatting for too long and I want to leave some time for questions, but just some of the take-home points is some of these messages I want you to take away is that there's been this disproportionate impact of the pandemic on stress and health. But was something encouraging is that we found that these positive events can occur even in the midst of stress, and that this points to some potential actionable strategies for shaping daily life. Yeah, so we are currently kind of trying to extend this work, which I'm happy to talk more about. And yeah, I wanted to share my email address and my lab's website. We're called the Uplift Health Lab, in case you're interested in learning more. So with that, I'll stop my screen share and I'll take some questions.
Thanks so much, Nancy. I think we have a couple of questions from the audience about your excellent presentation. So the first question is, what do you believe accounts for the stress percent differences between Canadians and Americans that I think you touched on earlier in the presentation?
Yes. So I should say that the data on Americans, so there were more Americans who reported feeling that stress levels were worse during the pandemic for them. That data was actually from 2020, whereas the Canadian one was from 2021. That's one potential difference is just the timing. But of course, we know there are many different aspects of our between the two countries, and I think a major one is pandemic response in terms of the public health response, the level of risk and the rates of hospitalizations, for example, and access to healthcare that is much more difficult in the US, especially for people who don't have health insurance or who are kind of part of vulnerable populations.
Thank you. And Sandra's wondering, do you think, or has it been proven that sleep based on taking sleeping pills or medication is not considered good sleep for the positive results compared to natural sleep?
Oh, I actually don't know the answer to this. This is such a great question. I'm not sure. And of course, I know people are trying in many ways to try to get better sleep, everything from meditating to using medications and supplements to trying to really change their habits. What we do know, of course, from the insomnia literature is that the behaviors are really important. I'm not sure if they're more important than other kinds of other ways of intervening, but certainly there are the behaviors of kind of keeping consistent sleep schedules and kind of associating one's bed with kind of quickly falling asleep and being asleep. So those are kind of habits that are, I think, important to build over time. But I'm not sure whether it's more important than other kinds of intervention strategies.
Great. I think we have time for one or two more questions. So Greg posted his ideas or thoughts into the chat. So I guess I will leave that for you to take a look at just after this Q&A period. But Kathy had one more question about, so she says, it seems that there were many more pro-social events happening early pandemic versus the events that are occurring now, causing more stress for onlookers. Your thoughts?
Versus the events that are occurring now. I actually have not. We are in the process of going back into the field and collecting more data about pro-social activities. So I'm actually not sure how much that has changed, at least in the sample that I looked at. But I would be curious about whether people are volunteering less and so on, or less likely to provide support. And in some ways, it does make it does make sense that it feels like life is in some ways, and for some people, getting a little bit closer to normal. Yes, the praise for the healthcare workers. Yeah, I do think that all of the intense media coverage and also some of the more strict kind of stay-at-home restrictions might have led people to kind of think more about others, to try to focus on helping others and reaching out. And yeah, it could just be a lot of fatigue that people have felt feel now after these past couple of years um, of chronic stress.
Okay, I think we actually have some time to share Greg's thoughts. So Greg says that relating to the graphs covering the frequencies of categories of stress by age group, I wonder if the greater reported other stressors among older populations may reflect the greater likelihood of events that could be perceived as indignities or saddening as people age and lose autonomy alongside motor function. So for example, greater difficulty moving, reaching things and carrying out basic tasks, pain from old injuries or surgeries, forgetfulness, loss of friends, etc. This might be captured elsewhere in the categories, but I thought I would share just in case this has been overlooked or dismissed as invalid. So Nancy, if you have any thoughts on that.
Thank you, Greg. This was such a great question and such great thoughts. Yeah, so we actually, I did not present this, but when we asked about unfair treatment, so that everyday discrimination, we actually found that being treated unfairly based on one's age was the most commonly reported kind of unfair treatment, at least in our sample. So it is the case that during the pandemic, I mean, we've seen this everywhere, a lot of talk about healthcare decisions that are made based on a person's age. How do we allocate resources? It could be based on a person's age, and just a lot of ageist discourse in society and in the media. So it is the case that that these other stressors could reflect those those experiences of everyday discrimination, as well as more coping with these major stressors like loss of a loved one, isolation, and health problems. Yeah, and I also, I'm so glad I get to talk about this because I want to point out that our sample, they were relatively healthy in that they're living in the community, so they're not institutionalized or they're not living in long-term care facilities. So obviously our data, we're really kind of talking about people who are still relatively healthy and kind of it is the case that as people get older, much later in life, so like past 70s and 80s, there's a much sharper decline in well-being as these health problems become exacerbated.
Okay, again, we'd like to thank Nancy for leading our webinar today. There was a question about whether the slides will be sent to attendees. So a full recording of the webinar will be available at our website. You can click the side tab labeled events, and then you can click on the sub tab labeled Bear Webinar Series. And I'd just like to mention that our next webinar will be March 17th, 2022 at 12 p.m. Eastern Time, and we'll be hearing from Varun Gari, from the Brookings Institute. So I want to thank Nancy again and thank everyone for attending. You can now exit this webinar by closing your Zoom screen. Bye, everyone.
Bye.